The ballroom shimmered the way expensive places always do when they're trying to impress people who already believe they deserve it. Crystal chandeliers hung low, casting warm light over polished marble floors. White tablecloths stretched across round tables, each one dressed with folded napkins that looked like art and centerpieces that probably cost more than my first month's salary back when I was young. Laughter bounced off the walls, sharp and careless. Servers moved like shadows, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, smiling at everyone except the people who didn't seem important enough to notice. It was my company's annual celebration. Another year in business. Another milestone. I stood near the edge of the room, holding an empty glass, watching people enjoy something I had built but no longer felt welcome in. Most of the guests didn't recognize me. That wasn't surprising. Over the years, my presence had faded from boardrooms and brochures, replaced by younger faces, sharper suits, louder voices. I wasn't dressed poorly. Just simply. A dark blazer I'd owned for years, clean shoes, nothing flashy. I'd learned long ago that clothes didn't make the man. Still, in that room, simplicity looked a lot like insignificance. Across the room, my son stood surrounded by executives and investors, laughing easily, one hand resting casually in his pocket like he belonged exactly where he was. He looked confident. Comfortable. The kind of man people assumed had always been successful. Beside him was his wife, my daughter-in-law, scanning the room with sharp eyes, her smile appearing and disappearing as needed. She had perfected that look over the years. Warm enough to charm. Cold enough to cut. I hadn't planned to stay long. I told myself I'd show my face, congratulate a few people, then slip out quietly. That was my role now. Silent. Peripheral. Useful only in memory. I moved toward one of the long buffet tables, more out of habit than hunger. Plates of food were arranged carefully, each dish labeled with small cards in elegant handwriting. People stood in loose lines, chatting, laughing, serving themselves generously. I picked up a plate and waited. That's when I heard her voice. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was confident, amused, and just sharp enough to land. Charity cases eat last. There was a pause. Then laughter. Not roaring laughter. Not cruel laughter. The worst kind. Polite laughter. The kind people use when they're not sure if something is funny but they don't want to look uncomfortable. The kind that lets the speaker know they got away with it. I felt it before I fully understood it. That tightening in the chest. That slow heat behind the eyes. I turned my head slightly. She was looking directly at me. Our eyes met for a brief second. She smiled. Not apologetically. Not awkwardly. A clean, satisfied smile. Like someone who had just made a point and knew it had landed. A few people glanced in my direction. Some looked away quickly. Others pretended not to notice at all. Conversations resumed. Glasses clinked. Life moved on. I looked toward my son. He was close enough that he must have heard her. He saw me standing there, plate in hand. For a moment, I thought he might step forward. Say something. Anything. Instead, he looked away. That was the moment that broke something in me. Not her words. Not the laughter. His silence. I stood there for another second, long enough for the noise of the room to feel distant, like I was underwater. Then I gently placed the empty plate back on the table. I didn't rush. I didn't react. I simply turned and walked toward the exit. No one stopped me. The doors closed softly behind me, cutting off the music and the laughter. Outside, the night air was cool and still. The venue sat on a manicured estate, gravel crunching under my shoes as I walked toward the parking lot. The sound stopped me for a moment. Gravel. The same sound I'd heard decades ago, standing on an empty lot with nothing but a vision and a woman who believed in me more than I believed in myself. I kept walking. The drive home was quiet. City lights blurred past as memories filled the silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't need distraction. My thoughts were loud enough. By the time I reached my apartment, it was late. The building was older, nothing impressive. The kind of place people don't brag about. I liked that. It didn't ask me to perform. I locked the door behind me, set my keys on the small table by the entrance, and sat down in the dark. That's when my phone buzzed. A text message. From my son. Dad. Another bubble appeared. The business needs your investment. I stared at the screen for a long time. Read it again. Then again. No apology. No acknowledgement. No mention of what had happened earlier that night. Just an assumption. A request. A quiet expectation that I would, as always, step in. I typed one response. Never again. I set the phone down and turned it face down on the table. What happened next didn't begin that night. It began years earlier, long before the laughter, long before the insult, long before I learned how invisible I had become. I started that company with my late wife in a rented workshop that smelled like oil and dust. We didn't have investors. We didn't have connections. We had ideas, long nights, and a stubborn belief that if we worked hard enough, it would matter. She handled the numbers. I built the machines. When things went wrong, and they often did, we figured it out together. When our son was born, we didn't slow down. We just adjusted. He grew up around blueprints and balance sheets, learned early that success didn't come from titles but from responsibility. At least, that's what I thought we were teaching him. As the company grew, so did the distance. Boardrooms replaced workshops. Consultants replaced conversations. Somewhere along the way, my role shifted from builder to background. I didn't fight it. I told myself that was the natural order of things. That stepping back was part of growing older. That my time had passed. But stepping back doesn't mean stepping aside. And it certainly doesn't mean being erased. Years before that party, when the company hit a financial wall because of reckless expansion, I had quietly stepped in. I didn't announce it. I didn't demand recognition. I arranged the capital through channels that kept my name out of it. The company survived. My son took credit. Life went on. I watched from a distance as decisions were made without me. As traditions were discarded. As people who had given their lives to the company were pushed out in favor of optics and image. Each time, I told myself it wasn't my place anymore. That night at the party, standing there with an empty plate, I finally understood the cost of that silence. The next morning, the notices went out. They were formal. Professional. Emotionless. They didn't mention parties or insults or laughter. They didn't need to. They spoke the language that mattered in that world. Deadlines. Clauses. Numbers that could not be argued with. Phones rang. Meetings were called. Smiles faded. My son called me 3 times that day. I didn't answer. By the end of the week, his messages changed in tone. Confusion turned into urgency. Urgency turned into panic. I watched it all quietly. When we finally sat across from each other in a conference room, weeks later, he looked smaller than I remembered. Tired. Frantic. The confidence he wore so easily at the party was gone. He asked questions. Demanded explanations. Tried to regain control. I answered calmly. Clearly. Without anger. I told him the truth. About the investments. About the ownership. About the choices he had made and the consequences that followed them. He looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. Or maybe like he was seeing me for the first time. His wife sat beside him, silent now. The sharp smile gone. Her eyes calculating, searching for exits. When it was over, there was nothing left to say. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult them. I didn't laugh. I stood up, thanked everyone for their time, and walked out. The world didn't end. The company changed hands. People kept their jobs. Life moved forward. A few days later, the money arrived. More than I had ever imagined needing. It sat there on a screen, meaningless on its own. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood. A place with a porch and a yard and enough space to breathe. I planted a garden. I cooked my own meals. I slept through the night. A letter came from my son weeks later. Pages of words. Regret. Justification. Apologies tangled with excuses. I read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. Some lessons can't be taught. They can only be learned. Now, when I think back to that night, to the chandeliers and the laughter and the words that cut deeper than anyone realized, I don't feel anger. I feel clarity. Because I learned something I wish I had understood sooner. Respect is not something you beg for. Dignity is not something you borrow. And silence, when it's mistaken for weakness, eventually becomes the loudest answer of all. I eat when I'm hungry now. I speak when it matters. And I no longer wait my turn at tables I built myself. That, more than anything else, is what finally made the food taste right again. For a long time after everything settled, I avoided looking back. Not because it hurt too much, but because I didn't want to romanticize it. Pain has a way of turning itself into a story we tell too often, until it becomes comfortable. I didn't want comfort. I wanted truth. The quiet house helped with that. In the mornings, sunlight filtered through the kitchen window and landed on the table where I drank my coffee. No meetings. No phone calls demanding answers. No one needing me to fix what they had broken. Just the soft ticking of a clock and the distant sound of traffic starting its day. For the first time in years, my mornings belonged to me. Sometimes, I thought about my wife in those moments. She would have liked this place. She always preferred calm over grandeur. I could almost hear her voice reminding me that peace wasn't something you earned at the end of your life. It was something you chose, over and over, even when it was inconvenient. I wondered what she would have said about the party. About the comment. About our son looking away. She wouldn't have been surprised. She had seen the shift before I did. She noticed how quickly gratitude turned into entitlement. How easily people forget who carried them when the ground was unstable. I had chosen to believe things would correct themselves. She had understood that silence, left unchecked, teaches people exactly how far they can go. In the weeks that followed the sale, messages continued to arrive. Not just from my son, but from people I hadn't heard from in years. Former colleagues. Old board members. Even a few investors who suddenly remembered my name once they learned who had really been behind the curtain. I didn't respond to most of them. Not out of bitterness. Out of clarity. I had spent decades being accessible, available, dependable. And all it had earned me was a seat at the edge of the room and an empty plate. I wasn't interested in returning to that role. One afternoon, while I was tending to the small garden behind the house, my phone rang. I almost ignored it. Old habits die slowly. But something told me to answer. It was a former employee. A man who had worked on the factory floor when the company was still young. His voice was hesitant, like he wasn't sure he had the right number. I just wanted to say thank you, he said. You probably don't remember me. I did remember him. I remembered his dedication. His loyalty. How quietly he had been let go years earlier when efficiency reports replaced human judgment. He told me how the transition had saved jobs. How the new owners had brought stability instead of spectacle. How people felt hopeful again. After we hung up, I sat on the porch for a long time. That mattered more than any number on a screen. My son tried calling again after that. Weeks had passed. Time had worn the panic into something softer, more desperate. I let it ring. Then, finally, one evening, I answered. He didn't speak at first. "Dad," he said eventually, his voice unfamiliar. "Smaller." I waited. "I didn't understand," he said. I thought you'd always be there. I thought it didn't matter what we said or did." There it was. The truth, finally spoken. "I know," I replied. Silence stretched between us. Not the kind that hurts. The kind that reveals. "I lost everything," he said quietly. I looked out at the garden. The soil under my nails. The simple proof of work that actually grew something. "No," I said. "You lost what you didn't earn. There's a difference." He didn't argue. He asked if we could meet. Just to talk. I told him maybe someday. Not yet. He sounded disappointed, but he accepted it. For the first time in a long while, he accepted something without pushing. After that call, I slept better than I had in years. Time has a way of smoothing the sharpest edges. Months passed. Seasons changed. The garden grew fuller. I learned the rhythms of my new neighborhood. The names of the neighbors. The best time of day to sit on the porch without the sun in my eyes. I began volunteering a few afternoons a week at a local workshop that taught trade skills to young people who didn't see themselves in college classrooms. They reminded me of myself at that age. Hungry. Curious. Rough around the edges. Full of potential that just needed direction. They didn't know my past. They didn't care. To them, I was just a man who knew how things worked and was willing to teach. It was enough. Sometimes, late in the evening, I thought about the party again. About the words that started it all. About the laughter that followed. I realized something important then. If that moment hadn't happened, if the insult hadn't been so public, so sharp, so undeniable, I might still be shrinking myself to fit into rooms that no longer respected me. I might still be confusing patience with loyalty, silence with love. In a strange way, I was grateful. Grateful for the clarity that comes when someone finally says out loud what they've been thinking all along. Grateful for the pain that forced me to choose myself. Grateful for the reminder that dignity isn't loud, but it is firm. I never did attend another company party. I didn't need to. The last time I heard about my daughter-in-law, she had moved on quickly, attaching herself to another version of success. That didn't surprise me either. Some people chase light without ever learning how to be warm. My son sent another letter eventually. Shorter this time. Fewer explanations. More accountability. He told me he was starting over. Smaller. Humbler. I hoped he meant it. I didn't reply, but I didn't throw it away either. Forgiveness, I've learned, doesn't always come with reconciliation. Sometimes it comes with distance. Sometimes it comes with letting people grow without you holding the ladder. On my 69th birthday, I cooked myself a quiet dinner. Nothing elaborate. Just something warm and familiar. I set the table for one and sat down without rushing. As I took the first bite, I smiled. Not because I had won. Not because anyone had lost. But because I was finally at peace with the man I saw reflected back at me. I had given my best years to building something that mattered. I had loved deeply. I had endured quietly. And when it became necessary, I had stood up. That was enough. If there's one thing I know now, it's this: your worth doesn't disappear just because others stop acknowledging it. It waits. Patient. Solid. Untouched by laughter or silence or cruelty disguised as humor. And when you finally decide to honor it, the world adjusts. It always does. The adjustment didn't happen all at once. It never does. Change like that is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in slowly, the way evening settles over a long day. There were moments, even months later, when doubt crept in. Late at night, when the house was too quiet and memory got loud. I would replay scenes in my head. Wonder if I should have spoken sooner. Wonder if I had waited too long. Wonder if I had mistaken restraint for wisdom and patience for love. But every time those thoughts surfaced, something grounded me. The porch. The garden. The steady rhythm of a life no longer built around approval. I began to understand that regret isn't always a sign you made the wrong choice. Sometimes it's just proof that the choice mattered. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes I'd brought from the apartment, I found photographs I hadn't looked at in years. Black and white shots of the first workshop. Me standing beside a machine that barely worked, grease on my hands, smiling like I'd already won. My wife beside me, arm hooked through mine, her expression calm and certain. She always looked certain. There was another photo of our son as a child, sitting on a crate in the factory, safety goggles slipping down his nose. He had been proud then. Proud of where he came from. Proud of what we were building. I stared at that picture for a long time. People don't wake up one day and become entitled. It happens slowly. Comfort dulls gratitude. Distance dulls memory. And silence, if it lasts long enough, teaches people that respect is optional. I put the photos back in the box and closed the lid. Some chapters are meant to stay closed. As the year moved on, I noticed something else. Without the constant pressure to prove myself, my body felt lighter. I slept better. I laughed more easily. Even my thoughts felt less crowded. I wasn't bracing for the next disappointment anymore. That was freedom. One evening, as I watered the garden, a neighbor stopped by the fence. We talked about nothing important. Weather. Tomatoes. How quickly time passes. Before he left, he said something that stayed with me. You seem settled, he said. Like someone who knows where he belongs. That night, I realized he was right. For most of my life, I belonged to responsibilities. To expectations. To other people's versions of who I was supposed to be. I had worn those roles faithfully. Provider. Fixer. Silent supporter. But belonging to yourself is different. It doesn't ask you to shrink. It doesn't ask you to wait your turn. It doesn't laugh when you're hungry. Months later, my son and I met again. Not in a boardroom. Not across a table heavy with consequences. Just a small cafe halfway between our homes. He looked different. Less polished. More present. We talked carefully at first. About neutral things. Work. Life. The weather, again. Eventually, he looked at me and said something simple. I should have stood up for you. He didn't add excuses. He didn't blame anyone else. He just said it. I nodded. That was all that was needed. We didn't fix everything that day. We didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. We didn't rush forgiveness. We let honesty sit between us, unadorned. That mattered. When we parted, he hugged me. Not the polite kind. The kind that lingers just long enough to mean something. Then he walked away. I watched him go, feeling neither victory nor loss. Just acceptance. Some relationships don't return to what they were. They become something else. Quieter. More careful. More real. And some never return at all. Both outcomes are survivable. Now, when I think back to that night at the company party, I no longer feel the sting. I see it clearly for what it was. A turning point disguised as an insult. A door closing so another could finally open. I don't attend rooms where I have to earn the right to exist. I don't sit at tables that make me wait to be fed. I don't mistake familiarity for love. I live simply. Honestly. On my own terms. And when I sit down to eat now, alone or with people who truly see me, the food tastes exactly as it should. Not like charity. Not like obligation. It tastes like dignity. Dignity has a quiet sound to it. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand applause. It shows up in the smallest moments, in the way you move through the world when you're no longer asking permission to exist. I noticed it one morning while tying my shoes. There was a time when even that simple act felt rushed, like I was always preparing to be somewhere I didn't quite belong. A meeting. A dinner. A gathering where I would sit, smile, listen, and remind myself not to say too much. That morning, there was nowhere I needed to rush to. No one waiting for me to prove anything. I tied my shoes slowly, stood up, and felt steady. That steadiness stayed with me. I started taking long walks through the neighborhood, past houses that looked lived in, not staged. I watched people leave for work, kids wait for buses, couples argue quietly and then laugh 5 minutes later. Ordinary life. Honest life. The kind that doesn't require an audience. Sometimes people recognized me. Former employees, old acquaintances. Their reactions were different now. There was respect in their voices, but not the kind that comes from power or money. It came from something else. From knowing. From understanding that I had finally stopped bending. One afternoon, a woman stopped me outside the hardware store. She introduced herself as the wife of a man who had worked at the company for nearly 20 years before being let go during one of the restructuring phases. She told me he had struggled after that. Felt discarded. Invisible. But he always said you were kind, she said. That you remembered his name. That you listened. I thanked her, unsure what else to say. That conversation stayed with me longer than any praise I had received in boardrooms. It reminded me that legacy isn't what people say about you when you're powerful. It's what they remember when you're not. There were still hard days. Days when loneliness crept in quietly, sitting beside me on the porch like an uninvited guest. I didn't chase it away. I let it sit. Loneliness loses its power when you stop pretending it isn't there. On those days, I would cook something simple. A meal my wife used to make. Nothing elaborate. Just food meant to nourish, not impress. I'd eat slowly, at the table, without distractions. And every time, without fail, I noticed the same thing. The food tasted better. Not because it was different, but because I was. I had stopped eating around other people's judgments. Stopped swallowing words to keep the peace. Stopped telling myself that being quiet was the same as being kind. Kindness without boundaries is just self-erasure. I had learned that too late, but not too late to matter. My son and I spoke occasionally after that cafe meeting. Short calls. Careful conversations. He was rebuilding, he said. Smaller company. Fewer risks. More hands-on work. I listened. I didn't advise unless he asked. That was new for both of us. He never mentioned his wife. I never asked. Some truths don't need to be revisited. On the anniversary of my wife's passing, I visited her grave alone. I brought fresh flowers and sat quietly, letting the memories come and go without trying to control them. I finally did it, I said aloud, feeling a little foolish and not caring. I stopped shrinking. The wind moved through the trees gently. I imagined her smile. That knowing look. The one that said she had always believed I would find my way back to myself. Before I left, I stood for a long time, hands in my pockets, breathing in the stillness. Grief doesn't disappear. It changes shape. It becomes softer, less sharp, more like a companion than a wound. And in that softness, there is room for gratitude. Gratitude for what was. Gratitude for what remains. Gratitude for what no longer needs to be carried. As another year drew to a close, invitations arrived. Holiday parties. Networking events. Gatherings with familiar names attached. I declined them all politely. Instead, I hosted a small dinner at my house. Just a few neighbors. A couple of people from the workshop. Simple food. Warm light. Honest conversation. We laughed. We ate. No one felt the need to perform. When the plates were full, no one waited. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I stood in the kitchen looking at the empty table. Plates stacked neatly. Chairs pushed in. The quiet felt earned. I thought back to that night at the company party. The chandeliers. The laughter. The words meant to diminish me. And I realized something that made me smile. That comment had revealed far more about them than it ever did about me. People who measure worth by proximity to power will always be afraid of losing it. People who understand their own value don't need to announce it. They live it. I turned off the lights and walked down the hallway to my bedroom. As I lay down, the house settled around me, familiar and safe. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for approval. Not for permission. Not for a seat at a table that had never really belonged to me in the first place. I had built my own. And this time, I ate first. I didn't wake up the next morning feeling triumphant. There was no sense of victory waiting for me, no rush, no applause. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles after a long storm, when everything that could be knocked loose already has been. And that was enough. I made my coffee, stood by the window, and watched the day begin the way I always had before life became complicated. Cars passing. Birds on the fence. A woman walking her dog, lost in thought. Ordinary moments, stitched together into something steady. For years, I had believed that worth came from usefulness. From being needed. From fixing what others broke. From showing up even when I was tired, unappreciated, invisible. I had told myself that was love. That was loyalty. That was family. I know better now. Love doesn't ask you to disappear so others can shine. Loyalty doesn't require humiliation. Family doesn't laugh when you're hungry. Those are not virtues. They're warnings. I think often about the people who might see themselves in this story. The ones who sit quietly at the edge of rooms they helped build. The ones who are always expected to give, to understand, to forgive, to wait. The ones who are told, directly or subtly, that their time has passed, that they should be grateful for whatever scraps of acknowledgement come their way. If you're one of them, hear this. Your silence is not your obligation. Your patience is not a debt you owe. Your worth is not up for negotiation. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how long you've stayed quiet. It doesn't matter how many times you've told yourself, this is just how it is. It isn't. There is a moment that comes, sometimes late, sometimes painfully late, when you realize that staying silent isn't keeping the peace. It's teaching people that you don't deserve any. That moment is uncomfortable. It's lonely. It's terrifying. But it's also honest. When I think back to that party, to the laughter and the words that were meant to put me in my place, I no longer feel small. I feel grateful for the clarity. Without it, I might still be standing in line, plate in hand, waiting for permission to eat. I don't wait anymore. I choose where I go. I choose who I sit with. I choose when I speak. And I choose myself, without apology. That doesn't make me cruel. It makes me whole. So if you're listening to this and something in you feels stirred, unsettled, seen, don't ignore it. That feeling isn't anger. It isn't bitterness. It's recognition. It's the part of you that remembers who you were before you learned how to make yourself smaller. Honor that part. Stand up when it's time. Walk away when respect is gone. And never confuse dignity with arrogance or boundaries with punishment. There is nothing noble about eating last when you built the table. For a long time, I thought my story was about loss. About betrayal. About being forgotten. I was wrong. It was about remembering. Remembering my value. Remembering my voice. Remembering that no one gets to decide my worth for me. And when I finally remembered that, everything else fell into place. That's the lesson I carry now. That's the story worth telling. And that's why, at the end of it all, I sit down, take my first bite, and eat without shame. Not because I took anything from anyone, but because I finally stopped giving myself away.